Overseer Vantik heard it before he understood what he was hearing. A low, tuneless string of notes, 3 soldiers deep in the maintenance bay, drifting between the coolant lines of a supply shuttle. He almost didn't register it as sound at all. Thren work crews didn't hum. Thren work crews counted. Every task on a compact vessel had a rhythm built from numbers, not melody, because melody was inefficient and numbers were not. That was one of the first things a Thren officer learned in training, back when Vantik was young enough to believe every rule had a reason worth trusting. Efficiency is a discipline, and discipline does not sing. He stopped at the hatch and listened longer than he meant to. The soldier doing the humming was young, barely out of his second enlistment, hands deep in a coolant housing he wasn't supposed to be repairing without a supervisor present. He wasn't singing words. He didn't seem to know he was doing it at all, the way a person doesn't know they are breathing until someone points it out. His 2 crewmates worked beside him without reacting, which told Vantik this wasn't new. It told him it had probably been going on for weeks, maybe longer, and that he was only now catching up to something the bay itself had already absorbed as ordinary. Vantik cleared his throat, and the humming stopped so fast it was almost funny. The soldier straightened, saluted, said nothing, because there was nothing in compact regulation that covered explain why you were making noise with your mouth. Where did you learn that tune, Private? Vantik asked. The soldier's ears flattened, the Thren expression that meant something between embarrassment and dread. I don't know its name, Overseer. I hear it around the market square. The humans sing it while they work. He stopped himself, clearly deciding the sentence he'd been about to finish would not help him. Finish it, Vantik said. It's easy to remember, sir. That's all. It gets into your hands before you notice. That was the part that bothered Vantik. Not the humming itself. Humming was a trivial infraction, if it was an infraction at all. What bothered him was the honesty of the answer. It gets into your hands before you notice. As though the tune had gotten into the young man the way weather gets into a coat left outside too long, without asking permission, without announcing itself, and the soldier had simply learned to live with it the way a person learns to live with weather. Vantik dismissed him and walked the rest of the bay slower than he needed to, noticing things he had been trained not to notice because they were beneath the threshold of a formal report. A tech had a strip of woven fiber tied around her wrist, the kind humans called a friendship cord, plainly gifted, plainly worn on duty in violation of at least 2 minor uniform codes nobody had bothered to enforce. A supply sergeant had rearranged the ration schedule so the whole crew ate together, at the same table instead of shifts, because, the sergeant had explained once, almost sheepishly, when Vantik asked, eating alone had started to feel wrong, and he hadn't been able to find a regulation that required him to keep doing something that felt wrong once he'd noticed it. Felt wrong. A Thren soldier, using the word felt to justify a logistics decision, and meaning it plainly enough that Vantik hadn't even considered writing him up. Vantik had commanded this garrison on the concession world of Talvern for 6 years. Before that, he'd served on 3 other postings, none of them near a human population, and he still remembered, with a clarity that surprised him, the briefing he'd received before shipping out to Talvern. A senior officer, retiring, had told him the posting was easy duty, an old concession, no real threat profile, human client population fully compliant, minimal oversight required. You'll mostly be counting cargo, the man had said, and Vantik had believed him, because at the time there had been no reason not to. He had watched it happen slowly enough, in the years since, that no single day gave him cause to write it up, and now, standing in a maintenance bay full of small, harmless, accumulating changes, he understood that slowly was exactly how it had been designed to happen. Not designed by the humans, he corrected himself, standing very still with that thought. He didn't actually believe that, not the way High Command would want him to believe it. Designed by nothing. Just by proximity, the way rust happens to metal left near water, without anyone deciding it should, without anyone deciding anything at all. His comm chimed with a priority tone he hadn't heard outside of drills in 4 years. Compact Inspector General's Office. Incoming Review Directive. Effective immediately. He read it twice standing in the bay, the hum of the coolant lines suddenly very loud in his ears, and felt the particular cold that comes from realizing a private worry has just become official. Below the header was a single line of summary text, the kind meant to be read fast and understood immediately, pattern identified across multiple concession garrisons. Talvern flagged as probable point of origin. Point of origin. As though this were a disease with a patient zero, a single soldier, who'd caught something first and passed it along. Vantik almost laughed, and didn't, because he suspected that whoever wrote that line genuinely believed it, and he was fairly certain, standing there among his own soldiers, and their small accumulated habits, that they were wrong in a way that was going to make the next several weeks considerably worse for everyone. The directive gave him 11 days to prepare Talvern for a full compliance inspection. It did not say what the inspection was for. It didn't need to. Vantik had spent 6 years quietly, carefully not writing down exactly the kind of thing his soldiers had just shown him, and some part of him had always known that eventually, someone above him would stop pretending not to notice either. He looked back at the young private, now bent over his coolant housing again, silent, careful, not humming anymore. It didn't matter. Vantik had heard it. And he suspected, standing there with the directive glowing on his wrist display, that he was about to spend the next 11 days discovering exactly how many other things he had been choosing not to hear. He spent that night alone in his quarters going through 6 years of routine correspondence logs he'd never had reason to read closely before, the small administrative residue of an ordinary garrison posting. A request for extended leave to attend a human wedding. A supply requisition for ingredients that had nothing to do with standard rations, filed by a quartermaster who'd apparently been baking for the whole crew's birthdays for 2 years without anyone above him noticing or minding. A note, buried 3 years deep, from a young lieutenant thanking the garrison physician for staying late during a difficult human childbirth in a settlement that technically fell outside the garrison's medical mandate. None of it, taken alone, would have alarmed anyone. That was what troubled him most, reading it all in sequence for the first time. 6 years of small, reasonable, entirely defensible decisions, each one easy to justify individually, each one part of a pattern that no single officer would ever have been positioned to see forming, because no single officer had been required to read 6 years of logs in one sitting the way Vantik now found himself doing at 2 a.m, with 11 days on the clock, and a directive from the Inspector General's office glowing quietly on the desk beside him. He thought, not for the first time, of the retiring officer who'd called this posting easy duty. He wondered if that man had known, even a little, what he was leaving behind for someone else to discover. Myra Cade had lived on Talvern for 19 years, long enough that she sometimes forgot Earth's gravity felt different in her bones, and she was elbow-deep in a bread dough that had gone stubborn on her when Consul Odom knocked on the frame of the open kitchen door. "You're going to hear an announcement in a few hours," Odom said. He was Amber Hold's oldest resident Thren, a retired quartermaster who'd settled among the humans after his wife died and never quite left, and his voice had the particular flatness he used when he was trying not to alarm her. "I wanted you to hear it from me instead." Myra wiped flour off her hands and looked at him properly. He'd aged since she'd first met him, the ridges along his jaw softening the way Thren features did in their later decades, and she'd known him long enough to read the tension sitting under his stillness the way she used to read her grandmother's silences, back on Earth, before every phone call that turned out to carry bad news. "That's never good," she said. "A compact inspector is coming. A real one, from off-world. Not garrison staff." He hesitated, and for a moment looked less like a retired officer, and more like an old man standing in a kitchen that smelled like his late wife's cooking, which it did, a little, because Myra had learned the recipe from her the year before she died. Vantik didn't request it. "That much I know." Amber Hold was not a large settlement, 4,000 humans, give or take, tucked into a river valley the Thren had granted under a century-old trade concession nobody in the compact really remembered negotiating anymore. It had schools. It had a market square, where humans sold bread and Thren sold river glass jewelry, and both sides argued cheerfully over the exchange rate, an argument that had become, over the years, less about the price of anything and more about the pleasure of the argument itself. It had, as of that morning, 6 new families and 1 new grandchild, because Amber Hold had never stopped being a place people built lives inside of rather than just survived. Myra set the dough aside to prove and walked out into the square, because if something was coming, she wanted to see the ordinary version of the place one more time before it braced itself. Children were racing along the irrigation channel, bare feet slapping the packed clay path, voices pitched high and delighted the way children's voices are everywhere in the galaxy, apparently, regardless of species. A Thren boy named Ren, human name, given 3 years ago at his own insistence after his human tutor read him a book about a bird that traveled farther than anyone expected it to, was losing the race spectacularly and laughing about it in a way that made 2 elderly women on a bench laugh too, 1 human, 1 Thren, sharing a single cup of something hot between them because they'd forgotten to bring 2. He always loses, one of the women said to Myra as she passed. Every year. You'd think he'd learn to pace himself. He doesn't want to pace himself, the other said. He wants to run like it matters. A cooking fire near the grain store was being tended by a Thren widow named Tallis, who'd been taught the recipe by Myra's own mother, 12 years dead now, the recipe outliving her the way recipes tend to. Tallis caught Myra's eye and lifted a wooden spoon in greeting, and Myra lifted a floury hand back, and neither of them said anything, because after this many years there wasn't much left to say about a kindness that had simply become part of how the mornings worked. None of it looked like a threat to anyone. That was the thing Myra had never been able to explain to visiting trade officials who expected Amber Hold to look like a fortress or a laboratory. It looked like a town. It looked like the most ordinary thing in the world, 4,000 people and their neighbors sharing a river valley, arguing over bread prices, and losing foot races on purpose and drinking tea from the same cup, because someone forgot to bring 2. And she had spent 19 years understanding that ordinary was not the same as harmless. Only that harm was never the point of any of it. She walked the rest of the square slowly, the way she did most mornings when she needed to think rather than shop. A group of Thren elders sat outside the concession hall playing a tile game Myra had never fully learned the rules of, despite 19 years of watching, and one of them, a woman named Kor, who had arrived on Talvern as a young administrative aide before Myra was even born, waved her over. You look like a woman carrying bad news she hasn't set down yet, Kor said, not unkindly. An inspector's coming, Myra said. A real one. Kor's tile hand paused over the board. She was old enough to remember the early years of the concession, before Amber Hold had grown past a few hundred people, back when the arrangement between the settlers and the Thren garrison had been formal and distant and neither side had expected it to become anything else. I always wondered when someone would finally come and ask what all this was, she said, gesturing at the square with the tile still in her hand. 19 years is a long time for no one to have asked. What do I tell them it is? Myra asked, half joking, half not. Tell them the truth, Kor said, setting her tile down with the particular satisfaction of a winning move. Tell them it's a town. People are always so certain a town has to be explained as something else. It rarely does. Myra thought about that the rest of the way across the square, and was still thinking about it when she found Vantik at the edge of it an hour later, standing very still, watching Ren lose another race. You've heard, he said. Odin told me. She studied his face, which after 19 years she could read almost as well as a human's, the small tightness around his eyes that meant he was holding something back out of consideration rather than caution. You look like a man who already knows what they are going to find. I know what I've been choosing not to write down, Vantik said. I don't know what that adds up to when someone else does the counting. Tell me the worst version, Myra said. Not the polite one. He was quiet for a moment, watching Wren cross the finish line dead last, arms raised in triumph anyway, the human girl who'd won, laughing so hard she nearly fell into the channel herself. The worst version, Vantik said finally, is that they decide what's happened here can't be contained, and the only remaining option is to remove it. All of it. You? This place. Everyone in it. Myra had known him long enough not to flinch visibly, though something in her chest tightened all the same. Then don't let them decide that in a room without windows, she said. Bring them here. Let them watch Wren lose a race on purpose, because it makes an old woman laugh. Let them see the memorial garden. Let them see my kitchen. She thought about it and added, more quietly, let them see everything, Vantik. Don't manage what they find. The moment we start managing it, we are admitting there's something worth hiding, and there isn't. Vantik looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression she'd never quite seen before, not the careful neutrality of an occupying officer, but something closer to worry on her behalf, the particular kind of worry a person carries for someone they've decided, somewhere along the way, without ever formally deciding it, that they are responsible for. That is either the bravest thing you've ever suggested to me, he said, or the most reckless. Ask me again in 11 days, Myra said, and went back to her bread, because the dough wasn't going to prove itself, and because some part of her had already decided that whatever was coming, she would rather meet it with flour on her hands than with lawyers standing behind her. The inspector's shuttle arrived 9 days later, 4 days ahead of schedule, which Vantik understood immediately was not an accident. Inspector General Call did not walk so much as arrive, the way weather arrives, and his first act on Talvern's landing pad was to hand Vantik a data slate without a greeting. He was older than Vantik had expected, silver-ridged along the jaw, and he moved with the economy of someone who had long ago stopped wasting motion on anything that didn't need it. Read the summary, Call said. Then tell me if you're surprised. Vantik read it standing in the wind off the shuttle's cooling vents. 3 other concession worlds, Ilvash, Brawn's Reach, Corda Minor, all garrisoned by compact personnel who'd spent years stationed near human trade populations. All 3 had submitted, within the same reporting quarter, unusually high rates of what the report's authors, with evident discomfort, had labeled unauthorized effective drift, soldiers refusing reassignment away from human contacts, officers overriding standard threat protocols to avoid harming human civilians, entire units adopting human customs of shared meals, informal rank address, and the report noted this with something close to alarm, mourning rituals for human deaths that exceeded regulation grief leave by significant margins. They think it's deliberate, Vantik said slowly. High Command thinks it's a vector, Call said. A psychological agent. Something transmitted through prolonged contact that erodes command hierarchy. 3 garrisons independently compromised is not a coincidence to people who write policy for a living, overseer. It's a pattern. And Talvern, he tapped the slate, has the oldest, largest, least monitored human population in the compact. If there's a source, it's here. With respect, Inspector General, there is no source. I've watched it happen for 6 years. It isn't spread like a disease from one place. It happens to anyone who stays near them long enough. There's no injection point to find. Call's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness sharpened, the way a man's stillness sharpens when he hears an answer he'd hoped not to hear. That is a considerably more frightening thing to tell me than the alternative, overseer. A weapon can be found and disabled. What you're describing can't be found at all. He didn't wait for a response. He walked toward Amber Hold's gate, and Vantik followed, and neither of them said what they were both now privately calculating, that if Call was right, the only way to be certain the drift stopped was to be certain the contact stopped, and there was only one way on a concession world to guarantee that. Myra met them at the gate exactly as she'd promised, no lawyers, no prepared statement, just herself and Odom, and a pot of something that smelled like the kind of food made in large batches for people who might be hungry, and might not have said so. "Inspector General," she said. "Would you like to see the school first, or the memorial garden? I find people usually want to see the thing that worries them most, and I'd rather not guess wrong." Cole studied her the way a man studies a door he suspects is a trap, precisely because it isn't locked. "You've had 9 days to prepare a route through your settlement," he said. "I'm sure it's a convincing one." "I haven't prepared a route at all," Myra said. "You're welcome to choose the order. You're welcome to walk into any house, with an open door, and ask whoever answers whatever you like. I gave up trying to control what visitors see a long time ago. It never worked, and it always looked worse than just letting people look." Something in that answer seemed to land harder than Myra had intended. Cole was quiet for a moment, recalculating, the way people do when a response arrives that doesn't fit the shape they'd braced for. "The garden," he said finally. "Show me who you bury, and how." Myra nodded once, unsurprised, and led them both in, and Vantic walked half a step behind, watching Cole's face for the moment his certainty would begin, however slightly, to bend. That evening, before the formal inspection schedule began, Myra insisted on hosting a meal, not a banquet, nothing staged, just the ordinary communal table the settlement used most nights, extended by 2 chairs. Cole accepted with visible reluctance, the posture of a man who suspected hospitality was itself a tactic and had decided to endure it as data collection rather than courtesy. The table sat 11 people that night, 4 humans, 3 Thren garrison soldiers off duty, Odom, Myra, Vantic, and Cole at the far end, watching more than eating. Conversation moved the way it always moved at that table, in and out of 2 languages, someone correcting someone else's pronunciation without malice, an argument breaking out over whether a particular root vegetable was better roasted or boiled that somehow involved every person present within a minute. "Do you do this every night?" Cole asked Myra quietly, midway through the meal. "Some version of it," she said. "Not always the same people. The table's the same, though. It's been the same table 19 years. We've replaced the legs twice." "Why replace the legs and not the table?" "Because it isn't really about the table," Myra said, and didn't explain further, and Cole didn't ask her to, though Vantic saw him turn the answer over for the rest of the meal, the way a man turns over a stone looking for the underside of it. Near the end of the meal, one of the off-duty soldiers, a young Corporal Vantic recognized from the maintenance bay, asked Cole, with the blunt informality the table seemed to invite in everyone eventually, whether he had a family waiting for him somewhere. Cole answered before he seemed to decide whether he wanted to. "A sister. On the homeworld. We don't speak often." A pause. "I hadn't thought about that in some time." Nobody pushed him further. The conversation moved on to something about the following morning's grain delivery, and Cole sat quietly at the end of the table for the rest of the meal, watching the currents of an ordinary evening move around him, and said very little else, though Vantic noticed he didn't leave until the last dish had been cleared, well past the point courtesy would have required. The memorial garden sat on a low rise above the river, and it was, Cole noted immediately with clinical precision, integrated, human graves and Thren resting stones arranged not by species, but by year, side by side, as though death had been the only sorting criteria anyone had bothered to apply. "This is Elder Yosek," Myra said, stopping at a resting stone near the newest section. "He died 4 months ago. 81 years old, which is old for a Thren who's spent that many decades away from homeworld gravity." "I was at his funeral," Odom said quietly. It was the first thing he'd said since the gate. "I have been to 11 Thren funerals on this world. I have been to 40 human ones. I stopped keeping separate count somewhere around the 20th. It didn't feel like it mattered which kind of grief it was." Cole crouched by the stone, reading the small carved lines beneath Yosek's name, a Thren mourning verse, but rendered, Vantic noticed for the first time, in a meter that echoed something closer to human elegy than traditional Thren austerity. Someone had blended the forms without appearing to think it was remarkable. "Who wrote this?" Call asked. "I did," Myra said. "With his daughter. He asked me to, before he died. He said Thren verse felt too formal for what he wanted to say to his family, and human verse didn't have the right words for a Thren life, so we built something between the two. He liked that it wasn't quite either." Call stood without responding, and they walked on. In the school, a single long building where human and Thren children sat at mixed tables, working through a mathematics lesson that had nothing whatsoever to do with either species and everything to do with fractions, Vantik finally saw something crack in the Inspector General's composure. Not dramatically. A pause, half a second too long, watching Ren argue enthusiastically with a human girl about whose answer was closer to correct, both of them absolutely delighted by the argument itself, neither of them once glancing toward the two officers standing in the doorway, because two officers in the doorway simply wasn't as interesting as being right about fractions. They passed the garrison's small infirmary on the way back, and their call stopped without being asked, drawn by a low sound of laughter through an open door. Inside, a Thren medic named Senna was showing a group of human children how to set a splint on a stuffed animal, narrating each step in a mixture of common and Thren that neither language fully owned. When one child asked, with the blunt seriousness only children manage, whether Senna missed his homeworld, the medic considered it honestly rather than brushing the question aside. "Some days," Senna said. "I miss the way the light falls there. I don't miss much else. My work is here now." He paused, searching for a word, and settled on one that clearly hadn't existed in his vocabulary a decade ago. "My people are here now." Call said nothing until they were well past the infirmary, walking the last stretch back toward the garrison gate in the fading light. "He used the human construction," Call said. "My people. Not my post. Not my assignment. He's used it for years," Vantik said. "I only started noticing recently." How does a medic drift that far from standard vocabulary, and no one flags it in 6 years of routine review? "Because nothing about it ever looked like drift while it was happening," Vantik said. "It looked like a man getting better at his job. He has, if you check his patient outcomes. Better bedside manner, fewer complaints, higher recovery compliance among both populations. If you'd asked me a year ago to justify Senna's language on a compliance form, I'd have written it up as an asset, not a risk." Call didn't answer that, but he slowed his pace slightly, the way a person slows down when they want more time to think before arriving somewhere. That evening, back at the garrison post, Vantik was reviewing personnel files for the formal inspection roster when he found the letter. It wasn't addressed to him. It had been submitted, per procedure, to the garrison's routine correspondence log, the kind of internal request nobody usually read closely. Private Dessa, the young soldier from the maintenance bay, formally petitioning to decline her scheduled rotation off Talvern at the end of the season. "I understand rotation is standard practice, and I am not contesting the policy," she'd written, in the careful, over-formal language of someone unused to writing anything personal in an official channel. "I am asking for an exception because I have built relationships here that I do not believe I can simply set aside on a schedule, and I would rather serve out the remainder of my enlistment somewhere I have made myself useful to people I care about, than transfer somewhere I would be starting over. I understand this request may be viewed unfavorably. I am submitting it anyway because I believe it would be dishonest not to." Vantik read it 3 times. "I believe it would be dishonest not to." 6 years he had watched this world work on his soldiers, quietly, without a strategy, without a weapon anyone could point to, and here was the clearest evidence yet. A young woman risking her record to be honest about something the compact would call a defect, because somewhere in 3 years on Talvern, she had learned that honesty mattered more to her than her career did. He set the slate down and sat for a long time in the dark of his office, and for the first time since the inspection directive arrived, he He let himself think clearly about what Cole was actually proposing to do, and about what it would cost, not the compact, but the people standing in front of him every day, to stop it. The order came through 2 days later, and it was worse than Vantik had allowed himself to expect. Full quarantine protocol authorized. All compact personnel exhibiting effective drift indicators to be relocated for decontamination assessment. Human settlement amber hole to be sealed pending review. Contact restricted to essential logistics only, effective immediately. Cole delivered it in person, standing in Vantik's office with the flat patience of a man who had delivered orders like this before and expected them to be followed without theatre. Decontamination, Vantik repeated. What does that mean, precisely? Cognitive and behavioral assessment. In severe cases, memory-adjacent therapeutic intervention to weaken the affected associations. It is not painful. It is not punitive. It is medical. You want to erase what my soldiers have learned to care about. I want to determine whether they can still function as compact soldiers, Cole said, which, overseer, given a petition on your own desk from a private declining standard rotation for personal reasons, is no longer a hypothetical question. Vantik didn't ask how Cole knew about Dessa's letter. It didn't matter. What mattered was the list Cole set on the desk between them, 41 names, nearly a third of the garrison, flagged for assessment based on nothing more damning than shared meals, worn friendship cords, requests to stay. He scanned the list slowly. He knew every name. He knew, roughly, what each of them would lose if the assessment proceeded the way Cole described it, not just a habit, or a preference, but the specific, accumulated weight of years spent building something they hadn't set out to build and now couldn't imagine living without. An amber hold? Vantik asked. Sealed for now. If assessment confirms the vector originates here, and I expect it will, full relocation of the human population follows. Dispersal across multiple concession worlds, small enough groups that no single site can sustain this again. You're talking about breaking apart a community that's existed for 19 years. I'm talking about a compact-wide security failure that's existed for at least 3, Cole said, and for the first time, there was something almost weary in his voice, the tone of a man who did not enjoy his own conclusion, but had stopped looking for a way around it. I don't relish it, overseer. I'd genuinely prefer to find out I'm wrong. But I have 41 soldiers on this world who can no longer be relied upon to prioritize compact directives over personal attachments, and a compact that has watched this happen on 3 other worlds and can't afford a 4th. Convene your garrison. Decontamination begins at dawn. Vantik stood at his window that night and watched Amber Hold's lights across the valley, ordinary lights, kitchen lights and school lights and the low warm glow of the Memorial Garden's evening lanterns, and understood that dawn was going to arrive whether he was ready for it or not, and that he had, at most, a few hours left to decide what kind of officer he was going to be when it did. He thought of the retiring officer, who had once told him this posting was easy duty, mostly counting cargo. He wondered, briefly and uselessly, whether that man had ever caught himself humming, and whether he'd stopped himself the way Vantik once had, out of habit, or the way Vantik was no longer certain he wanted to. The decontamination center had been set up in the garrison's old cargo bay, sterile and unfamiliar, and at dawn 41 soldiers were ordered to report. 39 of them did. Private Dessa was the first to arrive and the first to speak, standing at the entrance rather than walking through it. Inspector General, she said, I've filed a formal procedural objection. Compact Regulation, Article 11, Section 4, personnel may contest medical intervention that has not been shown to address a demonstrated operational failure. I have not failed a duty assignment in 3 years. My record is clean. I'm requesting a review board before any assessment proceeds. Cole's expression didn't shift, but the cargo bay had gone very quiet. You've read the regulation, he said. I had a human friend show me where to find it, Dessa said, and Vantik, standing near the back, saw several of the other soldiers exchange glances that were not defiant, not dramatic, just quietly, stubbornly certain. "I'm not refusing an order, Inspector General. I'm using the process the compact gave me. If that process says I'm wrong, I'll comply." One by one, without coordination that anyone could later prove existed, 38 more soldiers filed the same objection. They did not shout. They did not link arms in defiance, the way Vantik had half-braced himself to see. They simply stood, patient, orderly, citing regulation numbers, requesting review boards, doing the single most threatening thing imaginable, following procedure, with absolute correctness, in service of the single most human thing imaginable, which was refusing to let something they loved be taken from them without a fight fought entirely on the terms of the people trying to take it. A young sergeant near the front, a soldier Vantik knew mostly by reputation, as one of the garrison's more conventional officers, stepped forward when it was his turn. "Inspector General, may I say something not covered by the objection form?" Call regarded him for a long moment. Briefly. "My mother died 2 years before I shipped out here," the sergeant said. "I never had time to grieve her properly. My unit trained through it. Nobody asked me to stop training. When my friend's grandmother died here last spring, a human, not even Thren, I was given 3 days by my own request, and I used every one of them, and I came back to duty better than I'd been in years. I'm not asking you to believe I've been compromised, sir. I'm telling you I finally learned how to grieve properly, and I did it on this world, and I would like that on the record before anyone decides to take it out of my head." Call did not respond to that directly. He nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement, and moved to the next name on the list. Someone, quietly, near the back of the group, began humming. It wasn't the tune from the maintenance bay this time. It was a Thren work chant, old, traditional, the kind sung during long logistics hauls, except reshaped, Vantik realized after a moment, into a rhythm that matched a human harmony he'd heard drifting from Amber Hold's Market Square 100 times without ever learning its name. 2 voices joined it. Then several more. Nobody was told to stop, because there was, technically, no regulation against humming while filing paperwork. Near the middle of the roster, a soldier named Corporal Reth stepped forward when her name was called and hesitated, clearly debating whether to say more than the form required. "Go ahead, Corporal," Call said, and there was something in his voice now, Vantik thought, that hadn't been there an hour earlier, not softness exactly, but a kind of attention that hadn't existed before the humming started. "I was on Ilvash before I transferred here," Reth said. 2 years. I never once wore a friendship cord there, never learned a human tune, never petitioned to stay past rotation. I did my duty and I left on schedule, and nobody would have flagged me for anything. Then I came to Talvern, and within a season I understood I'd been doing my duty on Ilvash the way a person eats food they don't taste. I wasn't failing anything. I also wasn't," she searched for the word, the same way Senna had searched for one in the infirmary, "present for any of it. I'd like that noted too, Inspector General. Whatever this is, it isn't a weakness that arrived from outside. It's more like something I was missing before, and didn't know to miss, until I had it." Call said nothing for a long moment, and wrote something on his slate that Vantik couldn't see, and called the next name. Call watched all of it with the stillness of a man recalculating an equation he'd been certain of an hour earlier. "This is not what a compromised unit looks like," he said finally, more to himself than to Vantik. "Compromised units break down. This is," he stopped. "Discipline," Vantik offered quietly. "Just aim somewhere you didn't authorize." Call didn't answer. He ordered the review boards convened, which under compact law required a minimum of 6 days to process 39 separate objections, which meant decontamination could not proceed that morning, or that week. It was not a victory. Vantik understood that even as relief moved through the cargo bay like a held breath finally released. Call had only been delayed, and a delayed man with Call's authority was still, in every way that mattered, a man with the power to end this the moment the delay ran out. The delay bought 6 days, and on the 6th day, Call summoned Vantik and delivered the decision Vantik had been dreading since the first order arrived. The review boards will take months to clear properly, Call said. I don't have months. High Command wants this contained now, not eventually. So I'm bypassing individual assessment. He set a new directive on the desk. Full relocation of Amber Hold's population, effective in 10 days. Dispersed across 7 concession worlds, no group larger than 300. The vector doesn't survive if the population it depends on doesn't exist in concentration anymore. It's not elegant, Overseer. But it's certain. Vantik read the directive and felt something in him go very cold and very clear, the way it sometimes did in the last moments before a decision he already knew he was going to make. 10 days, he said. Elder families who've lived here their whole lives. Children who've never known another home. You'd break 4,000 people into fragments of 300 and scatter them across 7 worlds, because 39 of my soldiers filed paperwork you didn't expect. I would do it, Call said, because I have 3 other garrisons already showing the same pattern, and if I don't act decisively here, I will be dealing with this on a dozen worlds within 5 years, and by then there will be no scattering that solves it. This is the last point where the math is still simple, Overseer. I intend to use it. Vantik carried the directive back across the valley himself rather than send it through official channels, because he owed Myra the truth in person, and because some part of him wanted, one more time, to walk the road between the garrison and Amber Hold while it still connected 2 places that belonged to each other. She read it standing in her kitchen, the same kitchen where this had all started 11 days earlier, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. Then she set the slate down very carefully, the way a person sets down something they are afraid of dropping, and asked, 10 days to pack 19 years. 10 days to pack 4,000 people's 19 years, Vantik said. Some of them longer. Cause Tile Group has been meeting in that square since before you were born. Word moved through Amber Hold the way bad news always moved through a small place, faster than any official announcement, faster than Vantik or Myra could have controlled even if they'd wanted to. By evening the market square was full, not in protest, not in panic, but in the particular stillness of a community absorbing something it didn't yet know how to carry. Odom stood near the memorial garden gate, unmoving, and when Myra found him there he didn't turn around. I buried my wife 11 years ago in that ground, he said. I was told, when I chose to stay here instead of returning home after her death, that a body given to Talvern soil belonged to Talvern permanently, under the old concession terms. Nobody thought to write down what happens to a grave when the people who visit it are relocated to 7 different worlds. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think anyone ever imagined they'd need to. Myra didn't have an answer for that. She sat with him instead, on the low stone wall at the garden's edge, and didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance she didn't yet have any right to offer, because she had spent 19 years learning that some silences were meant to be set inside of rather than solved. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived on Talvern, as a young woman with more optimism than sense, Myra allowed herself to imagine, fully and without flinching away from it, what losing all of this would actually look like, not as an abstraction, not as a policy outcome, but as 300 people at a time, boarding transports, watching a river valley shrink to a point of light and then to nothing, arriving somewhere new with no ground beneath them that remembered their names. She let herself feel the full weight of it exactly once, deliberately, the way a person tests an injury to know precisely how bad it is. Then she went back to the kitchen, because there was still bread that needed making regardless of what the next 10 days held, and because some part of her had learned, over 19 years, that grief and preparation were not actually opposites, and that a person could hold both at once without either one cancelling the other out. She was still awake, flour on her hands again, when Vantik returned near midnight to tell her he wasn't going to let the order stand without a fight, that he had 3 nights of data waiting, and one more conversation left to have with Call before the 10 days became irreversible. "Then let me show you the math isn't what you think it is," Vantik said the following morning, standing again in Call's temporary office, and pulled up the file he'd spent the last 3 nights building, alone, without Call's knowledge, because some part of him had known this moment was coming and had wanted to be ready for it. Operational performance, Vantik said, of every unit flagged for effective drift, compared against garrison-wide baseline. Mission completion rates, higher, not lower. Equipment failure incidents, down 40%, because soldiers who've adopted human maintenance habits check their own gear more thoroughly than regulation requires. Desertion, 0, across 6 years, in a garrison posting that historically runs at a rate of 1 in 20. Insubordination that actually compromised a mission, not one recorded instance. Not one, Inspector General, in 6 years. He let that sit. "You called this a security failure. Show me the failure. Show me one operational metric that has gotten worse, because my soldiers learned to care about the people they are stationed among. I've looked. I can't find it. I don't think it exists." Call studied the figures for a long moment, his composure intact but slower now, the way a man reads something he suspects he isn't going to enjoy finishing. "You're asking me to authorize a threat because it hasn't hurt anyone yet," Call said, but the certainty had gone out of his voice. "I'm asking you to define the word threat using evidence instead of discomfort," Vantik said. "Compact regulation requires demonstrated operational harm before population-scale relocation can be authorized. Article 9, Section 2. I imagine you know it better than I do. Show me the harm, Inspector General, in writing, with data, and I will personally oversee the relocation myself. But if you can't, then what you're proposing isn't security policy. It's fear, dressed in the right forms. Fear is not an unreasonable response to something you cannot measure," Call said, but he said it quietly, without the weight it would have carried 11 days ago. "Then measure it," Vantik said. "That's all I'm asking. Not for you to trust these people. Not for you to like what's happened to my garrison. Just to hold it to the same standard you'd hold any other risk before you dismantle 4,000 lives to address it. If the standard can't be met, that isn't a failure of my argument, Inspector General. It's information." Call was quiet long enough that Vantik began to wonder whether he'd misjudged the moment entirely, whether procedure and data had ever really been the language that would move a man like this. Then Call asked, in a voice that had lost most of its formal edge, "What happens to you, Overseer, if High Command decides I was wrong to suspend this? Wrong to even hear you out?" "I imagine my record reflects it for the rest of my career," Vantik said. "I've considered that. I'm asking you to weigh it anyway, because I don't think a career is a fair trade for 4,000 people's home, and I'd rather lose the first than let someone else decide I should have accepted losing the second." Call set the slate down and walked to the window, looking out over the valley the way Vantik so often had. For a long moment neither of them spoke. "There was a 4th garrison," Call said finally, quietly, in a voice that sounded less like an inspector's than a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying alone. "Before Ilvash, Braun's Reach, Corder Minor. A smaller posting, 5 years ago, that showed the same pattern early. High Command relocated the human population there before anyone thought to ask the question you're asking now. It went badly. Not violently, no one resisted, not the way your soldiers have. They simply complied, and scattered, and the garrison that had to carry out the order was never quite the same afterward. I read the after-action report. Nobody wrote down why, exactly, but half the officers involved requested reassignment within the year. I always assumed it was the difficulty of the operation." He turned back from the window. "I wonder now if it was something closer to what your sergeant tried to tell me in the cargo bay." The cargo bay's overhead lights hummed faintly, somewhere down the corridor. Somewhere across the valley, faint on the wind, came the ordinary sound of Amber Hold's evening market closing, voices and laughter that had no idea how close they'd just come to being scattered across 7 worlds by morning. Cole looked at the data for a long time. Then, without a word, he picked up the relocation directive and did not sign it. He didn't withdraw the accusation, not fully, not in the way Vantic might once have hoped for. Cole was too honest a bureaucrat for that. "I'm suspending the order," he said, 3 days later, standing once more in Vantic's office, this time with something that looked almost like fatigue rather than certainty. "Not cancelling it. High Command will want their own review of your data, and there will be others after me who ask these same questions with less patience than I've shown. This isn't finished, Overseer. I want to be clear about that." "I understand," Vantic said. "What I don't understand," Cole said, and for the first time in 11 days something in his voice sounded less like an inspector, and more like a person, "is why none of it stopped anything from working. Every instinct I have says a command structure this deeply threaded with personal loyalty should be fragile. Compromised. And instead I've watched it hold under more pressure than most garrisons see in a decade." He paused. "I don't have a category for that." Vantic thought of the private who'd written a letter about honesty, and the sergeant who'd finally learned to grieve properly, and the 39 soldiers who'd filed procedural objections instead of shouting, and the tune he still didn't know the name of, humming through a cargo bay of frightened, stubborn people who'd found a way to resist without ever technically disobeying anyone. "I don't think it's a category," he said slowly, working the thought out as he spoke it. "I think it's just what happens to people who are given something to care about and enough time to mean it." Before Cole left, he asked to see the garden once more, alone this time, without Vantic or Myra accompanying him. Vantic granted the request without asking why, and watched from a distance as the Inspector General walked the rows of graves and resting stones for nearly an hour, stopping longest, Vantic noticed later, at Elder Yosek's marker, reading the verse that belonged to neither language fully, twice. Before he boarded the shuttle, Cole stopped at the garrison gate and asked Vantic one more question, quietly, without the formal weight of an inspector's voice. "Your sergeant said he finally learned how to grieve properly on this world," Cole said. "I've been an inspector for 22 years. I have closed 9 garrisons for cause, relocated 4 client populations, and written more compliance findings than I can accurately remember. I don't believe I have ever, in that entire span, learned anything from an inspection except how to write the next one more efficiently." He looked out toward the valley, where the morning market was just beginning to open, voices carrying faintly on the wind. "I don't know what to do with what I've learned from this one." "You don't have to know yet," Vantic said. "You only had to not sign the order." Cole considered that, and didn't disagree, and boarded the shuttle without further comment, and Vantic stood at the gate long after it had cleared the atmosphere, turning the exchange over the way he suspected Cole would be turning it over for a long while yet. Cole left the following morning. The suspension order was formal, temporary, precisely worded to protect his own position if the review went badly, and Vantic understood that Amber Hold's reprieve was exactly that, a reprieve, not an ending. Someone else, someday, with less patience than Cole, would read the same reports and reach a harder conclusion. The uncertainty didn't disappear. It simply moved, the way weather moves, somewhere over the horizon where it could be watched but not yet felt. He told Myra that evening, standing at the gate where she'd met them 11 days earlier, no lawyers, no prepared statement, just flour on her hands again, because apparently she baked when she was anxious and had been baking continuously, by his estimate, since the inspection began. "It's not over," he said. "It's delayed. There will be more inspectors. Harder ones, maybe." "I know," Myra said, and didn't look surprised, and didn't look relieved either, exactly, just steady, the way she'd looked the whole 11 days. It was never going to be over in 11 days, Vantic. 19 years, and it's still not over. That was never the plan. Then what was? She thought about it, The way she seemed to think about everything, carefully, without performing the answer for effect. Just to keep being the kind of place worth defending, she said. Today. And then again tomorrow. We never had a strategy for winning permanently. I don't think that's a thing that exists. We just had a plan for showing up. 6 months later, Vantik stood in the same cargo bay where 39 soldiers had once filed patient, procedural objections against an order that would have scattered a home across 7 worlds, and watched Private Dessa comfort a new recruit who'd just received word that her grandmother, back on the homeworld, had died. The recruit was Thren, young, barely off her first enlistment, and she was crying in the quiet, controlled way Thren were trained to cry, which was to say almost not at all, holding it in with a discipline that looked less like composure, and more like a wound refusing to admit it had been made. Dessa didn't say the regulation things, the approved condolence phrasing, the standard grief leave paperwork. She put a hand on the recruit's shoulder and said something low that Vantik didn't quite catch, and the recruit's control broke all at once, and she cried properly, the way Vantik had watched humans cry in the memorial garden a dozen times, unguarded, loud, entirely unconcerned with whether it looked correct. Vantik walked past them without interrupting, and found himself, a few steps later, humming. He caught it almost immediately, the same reflexive catch he'd have used 6 years ago, the same instinct to stop, to straighten, to remember, he was an overseer, and overseers did not hum. He held the note a moment longer this time. Long enough to notice it was the tune from the maintenance bay, the one he'd never learned the name of, the one that had started all of this the day he'd stood in a doorway and listened to a private hum something he wasn't supposed to know. He didn't stop himself. He let it carry him the rest of the way across the bay, quiet, tuneless to anyone who didn't already know it, and thought, without any particular alarm, that somewhere on 6 other concession worlds right now, someone else was probably doing exactly the same thing, an officer, a soldier, an administrator, catching themselves mid-note and choosing, this time, to let it finish. He stopped by the memorial garden on his way out of the garrison compound, a habit he'd developed over the past 6 months without quite deciding to develop it. Odom was there, as he often was in the evenings now, sitting on the low stone wall near his wife's resting stone, and beside him, unexpectedly, sat Corporal Reth, off duty, out of uniform, the two of them talking quietly about nothing in particular the way people do when the conversation itself is the point rather than its content. Overseer, Odom said, nodding a greeting. I didn't expect to find you keeping company out here, Corporal, Vantik said. Reth shrugged, unbothered. Consul Odom's teaching me the tile game they play in the square. I am terrible at it. He says I'll improve. She paused. I told him about Ilvash. About not knowing what I was missing until I had it. He said that was the truest thing he'd heard from a soldier in years. It was also the thing that convinced the Inspector General not to sign the relocation order, Vantik said. I don't think either of us has thanked you properly for that. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything, Reth said. I was just answering the question honestly. I didn't expect it to matter this much. That, Odom said, with the particular dry amusement of a man who had outlived several decades of people insisting their honesty didn't matter, is usually exactly when it matters most. Later that evening he found Myra in the market square, closing up the last of the day's stalls, and told her about Call's letter, a short, formal note that had arrived that morning, notifying the garrison that the full compact review of Talvern's data would be delayed a further 2 seasons due to what the letter dryly called unresolved procedural questions regarding the definition of operational harm. Buried in the final line, almost as an afterthought, was a second notice. Call had personally requested reassignment to oversee the review board process himself, rather than hand it to someone unfamiliar with the file. He's protecting it, Myra said, understanding immediately what Vantik had taken most of the walk over to work out for himself. He's protecting the question, Vantik said. Whether that's the same thing, I don't know yet. There was no lattice to find and disable. No anchor node to strike. No single origin point that could be excised, sterilized, or scattered across 7 worlds to weaken it. It had never been a weapon, and it had never needed to be one, because it did not require force to spread. It only required time, and proximity, and the plain unremarkable fact that humans had never known how to be near someone for very long without eventually, quietly, deciding to care what happened to them. Vantik didn't know what would come of that, in the end. Whether the review would go badly. Whether some future inspector with less patience than Call would succeed where this one had paused. He knew only that whatever came, it would arrive to find more of itself already standing there waiting, in soldiers who'd learned to file honest paperwork, in a recruit who'd finally let herself cry properly, in an overseer humming an unnamed tune down an empty corridor, because for the first time in 6 years, he simply didn't feel like stopping. The silence he'd once found so unsettling, standing in a maintenance bay listening to a private hum something he wasn't supposed to know, had never really been silence at all. It had just been the sound of something starting, too quietly for anyone to notice, until it was already everywhere it needed to be.